Annenberg Media.
London, 1753. The kitchen staff at the King's Arm Tavern removes the oven door in order to squeeze in the main course, a 350-pound sea turtle. Public notices declare what is common in the West Indies is a luxury here. Caught in the Caribbean, live sea turtles were loaded into flat wooden tanks on board ship. Turtle soup became so popular that by the 19th century, England was importing 15,000 turtles per year.
In hindsight, of course, we can say that European taste decimated the turtle population. Understanding people's food ways as changing allows us to have a window on the past, on the processes of globalization.
In the 16th century, the world first became connected by a network of trade routes. Ships carried foodstuffs, textiles, metals, and other items of value from one part of the world to another. This global trade dramatically changed the patterns of food consumption and production over the next 300 years. Local and regional cultures were also changed. And for the first time, a global culture began to emerge. Studying food is an ideal way for historians to study the impact of globalization. The production, transportation, and consumption of food changed dramatically as a result of this new globally connected system of trade. The globalization of slave labor, opportunities for economic gain through importing foods, and the addictive quality of certain foods like coffee, chocolate, and sugar are three of the forces that altered individual lives, whole societies, and the entire picture of global trade. These changes in the food supply led to demographic changes, shifting millions of people across the globe.
Even in the earliest societies, food becomes a marker of really what it means to be human. And as societies become more complex, their palates become more complex, and food begins to reveal what it is to be part of a very specific cultural tradition.
The story of food raises issues about trade, globalization of labor, changing populations, deteriorating environments, and the beginning of a global culture. Old world foods and flavors like citrus, coffee, and sugar came to the Americas. And from the Americas, potatoes, chocolate, and chili peppers spread to Africa and Eurasia. But sailing ships also carried germs that spread deadly diseases from one port to another. Hundreds of vessels transported humans, bought and sold as slaves. The slaves, in turn, played a role in supplying the necessities and luxury items, feeding local and global tastes.
The supply and demand of these new foods caused major population shifts. The decline of populations in some regions and increasing populations were supported by the new foods in other regions.
The earliest forces of globalization dramatically affected two key locations in the world. In the Caribbean, the influences of Europe, Africa, Asia, and the New World were melded in a crucible of world cultures. And in Asia, maritime trade connected China with the Americas, inaugurating the first global network of trade. After 1500, neither region could be understood without reference to the wider world. Food provides a window on the process of globalization, and in turn, on globalization's cultural, economic, environmental, and social impact. Although Columbus sailed in search of spices, his 1492 Atlantic crossing was not remembered for its culinary delights. The basic foodstuff on board was the sea biscuit, a twice-baked bread of wheat flour that was so hard and so infested with weevils that eating it could be nearly as injurious as persistent hunger.
At the beginnings of the voyages, the ships were well stocked with preserved foods, dried lentils, and foods preserved in vinegar. But towards the end of the voyages, and sometimes these voyages could be unpredictably long, at the end of these voyages, they were forced to eat things like rats and seabirds. Although they were a welcome sign of land, they were also a welcome sign of meat. And the oily meat from the seabird found its way to the table.
Sailors faced more risks than starvation. Dangers lurked in the casks used to store liquids on board. Lead poisoning contaminated the sailors' drinks, causing a malady ship's physicians called dry bellyache. Nearly half of the seafaring Europeans leaving the continent for Africa or the Americas would never return. For those who survived, a different menu would await them in the West Indies. The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, among them the Arawaks, Tainos, and Caribs, subsisted on a diet that was fished, farmed, hunted, trapped, and gathered from their lush island environment.
Always the land was of the same beauty, and the fields very green and full of an infinity of fruits, as red as scarlet, and everywhere there was the perfume of flowers and the singing of birds, very sweet.
On Columbus's second voyage, from 1493 to 1496, the royal physician, Diego Alvarez Chanca, wrote about the flora, fauna, and peoples of the Caribbean.
The people come laden with ajes, which are like turnips, very excellent food. It is so sustaining to eat that it comforts us all greatly. For in truth, the life which has been spent on the sea has been the most difficult that men ever went through.
European sailors encountered strange and seemingly magical substances in the New World, tobacco for one. The native peoples ingested or smoked it as a religious drug, and an Aztec drink that combined two potent ingredients for spiritual ceremonies, the cacao bean, which the Aztecs called chocolatl, and hot chili peppers.
They were used to flavor drinks. They were used in ceremonial occasions. They were used in warfare. The smoke of the chili pepper could offend the eyes of the enemy. And over time, these changes in the uses of plants began to affect the availability of those products.
Columbus brought the seeds of chili peppers back to Spain, and the plant was grown in monastery gardens. Later, Portuguese traders carried chilies to many countries across Eurasia. They spread very quickly through the markets of the general populations, bringing a new spice to the cuisines of Persia, Indonesia, Africa, and India.
The uses of foods changed as they moved into new cultural contexts. So, for example, cacao was used in the Americas by indigenous peoples in ceremonial contexts. And when it went to Europe, cacao was mixed, made into a drink and mixed with cinnamon and sugar and served another purpose. Similarly, tobacco was used in spiritual and ceremonial quests in the Americas, and when tobacco reached other parts of the world, it became a cash crop and an addictive substance.
For the most part, Europeans looked down on the cuisine they encountered in the Americas. But a century later, indigenous foods like cassava bread, potatoes, and plantains were being consumed. The Spanish called cassava bread the bread of the conquest because native subjects offered it as a tribute, along with labor and other foods. In the 16th century, the Portuguese introduced cassava into coastal West Africa and the Congo Basin. Since cassava grows well in marginal soil and has the ability to feed large populations, it was ideal for feeding large numbers of slaves. The impact of the European Atlantic voyages became known as the Columbian Exchange, a term first coined by historian Alfred Crosby, who pointed out the consequences of global trade.
What Crosby meant by the Columbian Exchange was really that there were multiple connections across this big Atlantic world that interconnected the peoples of Africa and the Americas and Europe. The unintended consequences were not just that there was a European conquest, but rather that there were global consequences, that this in fact was a global pattern and a global process.
The first colonizers of the New World brought Old World crops and animals to feed themselves. Newly introduced pigs and cattle overgrazed and disrupted indigenous farming practices. The increased presence of meat and milk altered native diets, cuisines, and cultures. And the initiation of plantation crops meant clearing vast tracts of land, including forests, for profit. But environmental degradation was not the only lasting legacy. No food crop altered the patterns of production and consumption more effectively than sugar. The demand for this sweet substance caused great demographic and cultural change in the Caribbean. And sugar became the catalyst for the development of plantation slavery. It is thought that domesticated sugar originated in New Guinea, arriving in the Arab world in the 8th century. Sugar sold for high prices as a rare spice or medicine, and its production and trade became enormously profitable. In the 14th century, growing demand led Europeans to first establish cane sugar plantations in the Mediterranean and later in the Americas. Columbus carried sugar to the Caribbean in 1493, and by 1516, plantations were producing sugar for European markets. In time, sugar production and consumption influenced tastes and economies around the world. From a business standpoint, sugar cultivation required both large investments of capital and a steady supply of labor. Plantation slavery became the dominant mode of production in the tropics. The popularity of drinks, such as tea and coffee, among European populations greatly increased the market for sugar, and consequently the need for more slaves. Between 1508 and 1885, slave ships transported at least 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean.
Africans really constituted two sides of that triangle. They were consumers of products brought from Europe to Africa, and Africans themselves became commodities in the slave trade as they were transported across the Atlantic into the Americas.
Not all Europeans supported the slave trade. In England, an abolitionist pamphlet brought home the issue of slavery for the ordinary citizen. As the Englishman sweetens his tea, let him reflect on the bitterness at the bottom of the cup. The Caribbean colonies brought together cultures and cuisines from different continents, and the European diet did not survive the tropics unaltered. The cultural patterns of enslaved African peoples had a definite impact on their slave masters. On the island of Jamaica, the cuisine of Maroons, communities of freedom fighters and runaway slaves, influenced the new British overlords of the island. Not even Lady Maria Nugent, the wife of the Jamaican governor, was immune to the swirling aromas of cultural change.
The first course was entirely of fish, excepting jerked hog in the center, which is a way of dressing it by the Maroons.
In her diary entry of March 1802, Lady Maria Nugent described an elegant estate dinner that offered tables laden with foods derived from many cultures.
There was also a black crab pepper pot, for which I asked the recipe. It is as follows: a capon stewed down, a large piece of beef, and another of ham. Also, stewed to a jelly, then 6 dozen of land crabs, picked fine, with their eggs and fat, onions, peppers, okra, sweet herbs, and other vegetables of the country. And this, well stewed, makes black crab pepper pot.
The foods on Lady Nugent's table really represent the coming together of culinary traditions from different parts of the world. The jerked hog was a tradition invented by Maroons, which came out of African culinary traditions of smoking meat and cooking it very slowly. Cassava was indigenous to the Americas and an essential part of many pepper pots, which were single stew dishes. In addition, a number of the ingredients came from different parts of the world.
Lady Nugent's feast gives testimony to the process of creolization, the blending of diverse peoples, each with unique cultural traits. The term Creole originally referred to someone born in the Americas. It has since come to characterize both the culture and the cuisine in parts of West Africa, the southern United States, the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean, all places where indigenous culture mixed with African and European influences after the 16th century.
Foods in the Caribbean really reflect the process of Africanization. And food played an important role in African resistance. Enslaved Africans were often put in the position of growing their own food on provision grounds because slave masters didn't provide enough food for them. In addition, food formed a kind of resistance against the conditions of oppression under the colonial period. And in fact, often slaves used food in their resistance. Foods came to have special meanings, and foods, tastes, the meanings associated with them served to form a kind of resistance against domination.
The interplay of the Atlantic cultures shaped all aspects of the human experience in the Caribbean: language, literature, social relations, dress, and food. At the time of Columbus's voyages in the Caribbean, China was the engine of economic demand in East Asia and beyond. And China was the catalyst that eventually established the first global network of trade. Precious cargoes of spices, silks, porcelain, and other luxury goods enticed European traders to seek alternative routes to China. And the demand for one commodity stimulated an enormous amount of trade: tea. Scholars believe that the cultivation of tea probably originated in China and spread to other parts of the world. By the 8th century CE, tea was known throughout the Chinese Empire. A work known as the Classic of Tea appeared around 780, detailing the aesthetics of tea implements, the qualities of different teas, and the appropriate manner of drinking it. But tea's economic value was perhaps of even greater importance than the rituals surrounding it.
By the year 1000, tea was a very important commodity that was grown in different regions of China, specializing in certain kinds of teas. And many of the teas were grown on mountainsides so that the gathering of tea was referred to as harvesting mountains. It was a very important economic commodity.
Tea was a divine herb, which some Chinese believed purified the spirit. But when the appreciation of tea reached beyond China to a European audience, its value as a commodity surged. By the mid-18th century, tea was the largest and most valuable component of the empire's international commerce. A French merchant wrote, "It is tea which draws European vessels to China."
We usually associate tea drinking with the British, but in fact, tea drinking didn't become a custom until the 18th century. And that's when it became such an important item of international trade for the Chinese. British workers used tea with sugar to fuel their industrial labors.
The British had long sought goods to exchange for tea and other Asian commodities. They settled on opium, which was grown in Bengal, a territory of the British trading concern, the East India Company. The impact of opium imports on China was devastating, both for the people and the government. Traffic in opium led to years of war and social disruption. By the 19th century, Europeans began to fill their demand for tea from other sources besides China. They imported tea plants to colonies in Ceylon and Java and developed their own tea plantations. The British Parliament gave up to 3,000 acres of land in the northeast region of India to any European planter who cultivated tea for export. The impact that new strains and types of food crops could have on a society had already been demonstrated nearly 1,000 years earlier in China. By the Song dynasty at the end of the first millennium, Chinese cuisine had taken definitive shape based on staple crops like rice and other grains.
The introduction of new strains of early ripening and drought-resistant rice around 1000 from the Champa Hindu kingdom of Vietnam really fueled an agricultural revolution in China because farmers were able to double crop and produce much more than they had been previously. And this created a population growth as well as an increase in the food supply.
After 1500, global trade brought new crops to China from the Americas. Suddenly, farmers could grow new foods such as maize and potatoes on land previously considered marginally productive.
The New World food crops that were introduced into China from the Americas, corn, sweet potatoes, peanuts, brought about profound changes in the productivity level of Chinese farmers.
Within a century, huge population gains marked the success of the Chinese agricultural system and the benefits of newly imported crops. China's numbers increased from 165 million in 1500 to 310 million in 1650. In 1720, Frenchman Pierre Poivre traveled to China and marveled at China's agricultural success.
By what art can the earth produce substance for such numbers? I examine and pursue the farmers through their operations and observe that their secret consists simply in manuring fields judiciously, plowing them to a considerable depth, sowing them in the proper season, turning to advantage every inch of ground which can produce the most considerable crop, and preferring to every other species of culture that of grain, which is by far the most important.
By Poivre's time, markets, merchants, and the Chinese state made it possible to transport grain up to 1,000 miles. Trade, innovation, and adaptation were changing the landscape of food in China. The slopes of southern China now grew American foods like sweet potatoes, beans, peanuts, cacao, pineapple, squashes, tomatoes, and maize.
But by the 18th and 19th centuries, those crops were also becoming more a part of the regular diets of people. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, for example, the white potato was spread by French missionaries and became a more important part of Chinese cuisines. When these New World food crops such as potatoes or corn were first introduced, people viewed them as famine food, that they were eaten only when the rice or wheat crops failed.
By 1800, China accounted for more than 1/3 the planet's population. China's diet and agricultural practices, like those of the rest of the world, had been significantly impacted by the introduction of new food crops. The wisdom of moving food around the world has been questioned by people over the centuries. Many believe that it changed the very order of nature. How long has the manipulation of local food sources been going on?
If I wanted to taste a dish from the end of the earth, I would rather seek it out there than to have it brought to me. For the most exquisite dishes always lack a seasoning that cannot be brought with them and that no cook can give them. The air of the climate that produced them. It is only at great expense that some rich man in Paris succeeds in having bad vegetables and bad fruits on his table the whole year round.
French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau expressed his fear of consuming foods from other lands back in the 18th century. We tend to think of adulterated foods as a recent phenomenon. In fact, in the time of Rousseau, foods in France were undergoing tremendous changes. French cuisine went through a phase in which the new Asian spices from global trade, like saffron, ginger, passion fruit seeds, were rejected in favor of popular local native herbs, tarragon, basil, and thyme. Rousseau wanted foods that had passed through the fewest hands as possible before reaching his table. He observed that human beings had disrupted the very order of nature, and that taking food out of its natural environment was something to be feared. Feeding the world's growing populations has meant the genetic alteration of plants and animals ever since the invention of agriculture, domestication of plants and animals. The path towards genetically modified foods started more than 10,000 years ago on every continent. The tension between forces of globalization and local cultural tastes continues to shape what we eat and how we feel about what we consume. The meanings of food that both bind us together as a human species and express the diversity of our global past.
As worlds and their accompanying foods collided, people were invited or forced to join into the creation of new cultural forms. The trade of food profoundly affected economies, populations, and cultures the world over. Throughout history, the production and consumption of food has been at the heart of the global patterns of change. What people eat has always expressed their identity, both for themselves and to others. As diets changed over time, cultures of consumption around the world changed also. And judging by the substantial transformations that have taken place since 1800, food continues to intensify the flavors of our global community.
Annenberg Media. For information about this and other Annenberg Media programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.